The air in the Grand Archives was a constant, a measured inhalation of recycled oxygen and the dry, sterile scent of data wafers. It did not smell of paper or dust or time, but of absolute neutrality. For Subject 734, alien, this lack of scent was a form of sensory deprivation that had become over the years a kind of peace. Here in the silent, temperature-controlled canyons of societal memory, his own biology was a muted hum, a distant signal suppressed by the daily regimen of hormonal neutralizers. The consortium mandated tranquility. It engineered it. Alien, classified as a recessive omega, was a testament to its success. He was compliant. He was efficient. He was, by all metrics, weak in the ways that mattered to the old world, and therefore perfect for the new one. His designation was a promise of his manageability. Recessive, a genetic whisper, not a shout. Easy to silence. He traced the edge of a crystalline data wafer, its surface cool and smooth, against the pad of his thumb. The light from the overhead panels diffused through the translucent shelves, casting long geometric shadows that shifted as he moved. It was a world of lines and angles, of clean, predictable order. His own reflection, faint and distorted on the polished floor, was just another part of that geometry. Pale hair, a uniform of stark white that bled into the light, eyes the color of a winter sky. He was not a person. He was a functionary, an organic component in a vast, silent machine. The thought was not distressing. It was simply a fact, like the precise humidity of the air or the regulated cadence of his own heartbeat. Yet today the rhythm was off. A subtle tremor began behind his sternum, a warmth that had no place in the refrigerated stillness of the archives. It was a phantom, a ghost of a sensation he had been conditioned to forget. He pressed a hand to his chest, the fabric of his tunic thin and unyielding, the neutralizer patch on his forearm, a small gray square against his skin, was meant to be infallible. It was the seal on the lockbox of his own genetic code. But the warmth spread, a slow, insidious bloom of heat coiling in his gut. He paused his work, his fingers hovering over a console. He drew a breath, but the sterile air offered no relief. Instead, it seemed to amplify the alien feeling inside him, the sense of something awakening, something stretching its limbs after a long, chemically induced slumber. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a cage, and the thing inside it was beginning to rattle the bars. He had felt these tremors before, small and infrequent, easily dismissed as psychosomatic glitches. The medics had assured him they were echoes, neurological static from a biology that no longer held dominion. His levels were stable. His function was unimpaired. Subject 734 was a success story. He tried to focus on the data stream, on the cool, logical flow of information. He was cataloging pre-consortium historical records, the so-called chaos era. It was a litany of instability, of emotional excess and biological imperatives run rampant. Wars fought over alphas, economies shattered by Omegan heats, a world held hostage by scent and instinct. The consortium had saved them from that, from themselves. It had replaced the tyranny of biology with the grace of logic. His fingers trembled. The warmth was now a definite heat, a low-grade fever that made the cool air feel sharp against his skin. A faint scent, sweet and unnervingly familiar like crushed blossoms in ozone before a storm, began to cling to the inside of his own throat. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the rising haze. This was not a glitch. This was a failure, a catastrophic system failure, and the system was him. He needed to get to the infirmary, to report the malfunction, to request an emergency dose. He had to contain it before it became a breach. A breach would mean decommissioning, recalibration. His existence, quiet and colorless as it was still his own. He would not surrender it. He pushed back from the console, his movements stiff, uncoordinated. The long, silent aisle of the archives seemed to stretch into an impossible distance. Each step was a battle against the thickening haze in his mind, against the sweet, cloying scent that was now beginning to perfume the air around him. It was the scent of his own undoing. And then the main doors at the far end of the hall slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred silence. Two figures entered, their dark gray uniforms a stark contrast to the white and silver of the archives. Praetorian guards, their faces obscured by reflective visors. They flanked a third figure, a man whose presence seemed to absorb the very light around him. Commander Valerius, the architect of the Omega integration program, the man who had signed off on Elian's own classification file. Valerius moved with a lethal economy of motion, his posture a study in rigid control. He was the embodiment of the consortium's ideals, an alpha perfected, his instincts disciplined into a tool of absolute will. His gaze swept the archives, cool and analytical, cataloging everything, dismissing everything. He did not look at the functionaries. They were furniture, scenery. Elian froze. Of all the alphas, it had to be him, the one man whose clinical detachment was legendary, the one man who saw Omegas not as people, but as data points on a chart of societal stability. The heat in Elian's blood surged, a tidal wave of panic and something else, something terrifyingly primal. His body was reacting to the proximity of a dominant alpha, a biological reflex he was supposed to be immune to. The scent, his scent intensified, pouring out of him like a confession. It was a scent of fear, yes, but also of desperate, undeniable need. It was the scent of a heat, a full, unsuppressed heat. The commander stopped, his head tilted by a fraction of a degree. For the first time, his gaze, the color of polished steel, moved and settled on Elian. It was not a look of recognition. It was a look of detection, like a sensor identifying an anomaly in the system. Elian's legs gave out. He fell to his knees, a choked gasp escaping his lips. The polished floor was cold against his burning skin. The world narrowed to the tall, imposing figure walking toward him, his steps measured, unhurried. The clinical air of the archives was now thick with a scent that had no place there, a scent from the chaos era, a scent of raw, untamed biology. Valerius stood over him, a mountain of quiet authority. His face was a mask of stoic neutrality, but Elian could see a flicker in those steel-gray eyes, a minute tightening of his jaw. He was processing the data. He was analyzing the breach. Subject 734, Valerius's voice was low, resonant, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a machine delivering a diagnosis. Report your status. Elian tried to answer, to form the words, to explain the malfunction, but his throat had closed. His body was no longer his. It was an instrument playing a song he had never been taught, a devastatingly beautiful, terrifyingly loud symphony of need. The scent intensified, a silent scream in the sterile air, and in that moment something shifted in the space between them. Valerius's expression for the first time broke. A fissure of disbelief, of raw shock, cracked the perfect mask. His breath hitched. A muscle in his neck corded. It was not a reaction of disgust or anger. It was something deeper, more instinctual. A predator catching a scent it had only ever read about in historical texts. A key turning in a lock he never knew existed. The bond, the myth, the ghost story used to frighten unruly alphas into compliance slammed into place. It was not a gentle connection. It was a psychic detonation, a visceral, violent tether that shot from Elian's core and speared directly into the commander's soul. Elian cried out, his mind suddenly flooded with an avalanche of alien consciousness. Cold logic, brutal discipline, a deep, glacial loneliness, and beneath it all, a suffocating, repressed rage. He felt the commander's shock, his denial, his horrified outrage at this violation. At the same time, he knew the commander felt his own terror, his pain, his shame, and the roaring, untamable inferno of his heat. In the sterile silence of the archives, surrounded by the ghosts of a chaotic past, the most chaotic element of all had just been born. The perfect Alpha and the broken Omega, bound together by a force their world had tried to engineer out of existence. Commander Valerius stared down at the trembling Omega, and for the first time in his adult life, his control was not merely tested, it was annihilated. He was not an officer. He was not a symbol of order. He was an Alpha, and his Omega was on the floor, burning for him. The thought was a heresy, a madness, but it was also, terrifyingly, the only truth left in the universe. The air, once a neutral medium, was now a conduit for a force he could not comprehend. The scent, it was not just a scent, it was information. A torrent of data flooding his senses, bypassing his logic centers and plugging directly into the most primitive part of his brain. It smelled of desperation and of a power so profound it bordered on the divine. Honey and lightning, milk and scorched earth. It was the scent of creation and destruction intertwined, and it was calling every cell in his body to a single, undeniable purpose: protect, claim, possess. His Praetorian guards shifted, their training kicking in. They saw a malfunctioning Omega, a biological hazard. Their hands moved toward their sidearms, multi-purpose weapons capable of delivering a sedative charge or a lethal one. "Stand down!" Valerius's voice was a raw growl, an animalistic sound he did not recognize as his own. The guards froze, shocked into stillness by the sheer primal authority in his tone. It was not the voice of their commander. It was the voice of a dominant Alpha shielding his territory. He felt the Omega's, aliens, fear spike through the newly forged bond, a sharp, icy shard in his own mind. The terror was not just of the heat, but of him, of the guards, of the system he represented. He could feel the Omega's entire history of compliance, the quiet desperation, the carefully constructed walls of emotional neutrality, all of it crumbling under the biological onslaught. He was not a weak, recessive specimen. The thought struck Valerius with the force of a physical blow. The classification was wrong, catastrophically wrong. No recessive Omega could generate a scent profile of this magnitude, this complexity. This was something else, something ancient, something the consortium's geneticists had dismissed as extinct, a prime. The realization did not bring clarity, only a deeper, more terrifying chaos. A prime Omega was not an asset to be managed. It was a strategic threat, a biological weapon of mass destruction capable of driving entire cadres of Alphas into instinct-fueled madness. And one had just gone into heat in the heart of the Central Archives, bonded to the commander of the Omega Integration Program. Irony was a concept Valerius had always found inefficient. Now it was the only word that seemed to fit the utter ruin of his reality. He had to contain this, not just the Omega, but the bond itself. This psychic leash that was now wrapped around his soul, transmitting the Omega's agony directly into his own consciousness. Every wave of heat that washed over Elian's body felt like a fever in his own. Every tremor of fear was a vibration against his own bones. "Quarantine protocols," Valerius said, his voice strained, fighting to reclaim the clipped, authoritative tone of command. "Section Gamma 7 is now under biological containment. Seal the sector. No one enters or leaves. Scramble. Communications. Acknowledge." One of the guards, his visor hiding his expression, managed a clipped, "Acknowledged, Commander." The other remained frozen, his posture radiating confusion and a low-level, instinctual fear. He could smell it too, the impossible scent. Valerius knelt. The movement was stiff, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Part of him wanted to run, to sever this connection, to retreat to the cold, sterile logic that had governed his entire life. Another part, a darker, older part, wanted to gather the trembling Omega into his arms, to shield him from the world, to answer the desperate call that was echoing in his blood. He reached out, his gloved hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before touching Elian's shoulder. The contact was an electric shock. Through the thin fabric of the tunic and the leather of his glove, he felt the searing heat of the Omega's skin. The bond flared, and for a horrifying instant, their consciousnesses merged. He saw through Elian's eyes. The world was a blur of white light and oppressive gray uniforms, his own face a terrifying mask of cold authority. He felt Elian's shame, the humiliation of being so exposed, so broken before the very man who symbolized the system that had broken him. Then Elian saw through his eyes. He saw himself, small and crumpled on the floor. But he also saw the war raging behind the commander's impassive facade. He saw the shock, the denial, the sheer, unadulterated panic of a man whose entire universe had just been inverted. And beneath it all, a terrifying, possessive darkness. An instinct so powerful it was a physical force. The commander thought he was weak. Elian had always known this, had accepted it as a fundamental truth of his existence. But now, through this horrifying, intimate connection, he saw something else in the commander's perception of him: awe, fear. The Omega pulled back from the touch as if burned, a small wounded sound escaping him. The brief merge had shattered him, but it had also given him a glimpse of a terrible, intoxicating power. Valerius stood abruptly, his control fraying at the edges. Prepare a containment unit, medical transport, Class 5 biohazard protocols. He was rattling off orders, trying to build a wall of procedure around the inferno that had just ignited in his life. He looked at the guards. You will speak of this to no one. The official report will state that Subject 734 suffered a catastrophic failure of his suppressant implant, resulting in neurological breakdown. Is that clear? Sir, the first guard affirmed. The second still hesitated. Valerius turned the full force of his presence on him, no longer a commander giving an order, but an alpha issuing a threat. Is that clear? Yes, Commander, the guard choked out, finally breaking his gaze. Valerius turned back to Elian. The Omega was curled on the floor, his body trembling violently. The sweet, intoxicating scent of his heat was beginning to affect the guards. Valerius could see it in the subtle shift of their stances, the way their heads were tilted. It was a subtle pull, a siren song that their training and their own low-grade suppressants were struggling to filter. But for him, it was not a song. It was a gravity well, pulling him in, threatening to crush his will, his discipline, his very identity. He was Commander Valerius. He was the pinnacle of the consortium's vision. He was in control. He repeated the words in his mind, a mantra against the rising tide of instinct. But the bond hummed between them, a living thing, and it whispered a different truth. He was not in control. He was bonded. He was snared. And the weak, broken creature on the floor held the other end of the chain. He had to get him out of sight. He had to get him somewhere he could analyze this, understand this, and sever this unnatural connection before it consumed him completely. Before the system they both served realized the true nature of the catastrophe that had unfolded in the silent, sterile heart of the Grand Archives. The journey to the medical bay was a blur of disembodied sensations for Elian. He was aware of being lifted, of the strange, unyielding strength of the arms that carried him. He knew with a certainty that transcended sight and sound that it was Valerius. The bond confirmed it, a constant humming pressure in his mind, a background noise of controlled panic and icy resolve. He was placed on a sterile hover gurney, a transparent containment shield lowering over him with a soft hiss. The world outside became muted, distorted. He saw the white corridors of the facility streak by, the faces of passers-by turning, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Through the bond, he felt Valerius's fierce, protective glare warning them away, a silent, invisible wall of pure alpha dominance. They were not taking him to the general infirmary. Valerius directed the transport to the high-security wing, a place reserved for high-risk assets and failed experiments. A place people went into but rarely came out of. The room was a cube of white, unrelieved by any color or comfort. It was a sterile chamber, more laboratory than sick room. The gurney docked with the central medical slab and the containment shield retracted. The air was frigid, scrubbed clean of any scent, but it did nothing to diminish the fragrance pouring from his own skin. Valerius dismissed the guards and the medical droid with a curt wave of his hand. The door slid shut, sealing them in. They were alone. The silence that fell was heavy, thick with unspoken horror and a terrifying intimacy. Valerius stood on the other side of the room, his back to Elian, his hands braced against a steel console. His posture was rigid, a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. Through the bond, Elian could feel the storm inside him. It was a tempest of conflicting directives, his duty to the consortium, his ingrained disgust for biological weakness, and the raw, undeniable pull of the bond, the instinct to comfort, to soothe, to claim the source of the scent that was driving him to the brink of madness. "What are you?" Valerius asked, his voice low and strained. He did not turn around. The question was not directed at Elian, but at the universe, at the ruins of his own certainty. Elian struggled to sit up. The heat was a relentless fire, his body aching with a need so profound it was a physical pain. But the bond was a strange anchor in the storm. It was an invasion, yes, but it was also a connection. For the first time in his life, he was not truly alone in his own head. "I am Subject 734, he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Classification, recessive Omega." Valerius slammed his fist onto the console. The sound echoed in the sterile room, a shocking burst of violence from a man renowned for his unshakable composure. "That is a lie." He turned around slowly, his steel-gray eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "Your classification is a lie. Your entire file is a lie. I have reviewed every document on prime genetics. The scent profile, the biosignatures, the sheer psychic force of the bonding event, it is all consistent with historical accounts. You are not recessive. You are a prime." The word hung in the air between them. Prime. It sounded like a judgment, a curse. Elian shook his head, a gesture of denial. "That's not possible. They tested me. My development was muted." "Or suppressed," Valerius countered, his mind clearly working, processing, analyzing. "Suppressed from birth, kept docile, a weapon kept in its sheath. Why?" He began to pace, his movements like those of a caged predator. "To hide you? To study you? Did they even know what they had?" The questions were not for Elian to answer. They were for the man whose faith in his system was shattering piece by piece. Elian watched him, and through the chaotic filter of his heat, a new feeling began to crystallize, a fragile, defiant spark of anger. For his entire life he had been defined by a label, a classification that marked him as less. He had been made to feel like a genetic error, a pale imitation of what an Omega should be. Now he was being told that was a lie. His weakness, his compliance, it had all been manufactured. He was not a mistake. He had been muted, caged. "You did this," Elian said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Your program, your classifications, you made me this." Valerius stopped pacing. He looked at Elian, and for a moment the Alpha, the commander, was gone. In his place was a man adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The accusation hit its mark. He could feel the truth of it through the bond, a sharp sting of guilt in the commander's cold, orderly mind. The system is designed to create stability, Valerius said, the words sounding hollow, like a creed he no longer believed. To protect humanity from the chaos of its own biology. By erasing it, Elian challenged, pushing himself up further. By labeling anything you can't control as a flaw, you didn't protect me. You neutered me. A wave of heat, more powerful than any before, washed through him. He cried out, arching his back, his fingers digging into the cold surface of the medical slab. The scent in the room thickened, becoming almost suffocatingly sweet. Valerius flinched as if struck. The bond transmitted the raw, unfiltered agony of the heat directly into his mind. It was a firestorm of sensation, of pure biological need. His own instincts roared in response, a deafening chorus demanding he go to the Omega, that he provide the comfort and release his body was screaming for. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white. His breath came in harsh, ragged gasps. He was losing. The battle for control was being lost. There are protocols for this, he forced the words out. His voice a strangled rasp. Emergency suppressants. Neural inhibitors. We can contain it. He was talking about the heat, but Elian knew through the bond that he was also talking about their connection. He wanted to sever it, to erase this unnatural intimacy that had been forced upon him. The thought sent a spike of cold, primal fear through Elian. This bond, this terrifying, invasive thing, was also the only thing keeping him from being just a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be corrected. As long as they were connected, his pain was Valerius's pain. His survival was tied to the commander's. It was his only leverage, his only weapon. "No," Elian gasped, the word torn from him. He focused his will, a thing he had never known he possessed, and pushed his own desperation through the bond. He didn't just let Valerius feel his pain, he aimed it. He wanted the commander to understand, to feel the entirety of his suffering, the years of quiet loneliness, the terror of his body betraying him. "Look at me. Feel what you have done." Valerius staggered back, a hand flying to his temple. A low groan escaped his lips. He was experiencing it all, not as a sympathetic observer, but as if it were his own. The hollow ache of a life spent in the shadows, the sudden, terrifying bloom of the heat, the utter vulnerability. It was a psychic assault. He looked at Elian, his eyes wide with a new kind of horror. It was one thing to read about the psychic potential of a prime Omega in a classified file. It was another to have one inside your head, using your own soul as a sounding board for his agony. The Omega on the slab was not weak. He was not a victim. He was a nexus of incredible, untamed power, and he was learning how to use it. The clinical White Room had become a battleground, not of weapons and tactics, but of will and instinct. And Commander Valerius, the master of control, was realizing with dawning terror that he had come to this fight completely, utterly unarmed. His entire life had been a monument to control. From the rigorous mental conditioning of the Alpha Academy to the ascetic discipline of his daily routine, Valerius had systematically purged himself of every instinct he deemed a weakness. He did not succumb to rage. He did not indulge in desire. He was a fortress of pure logic, his inner world as sterile and orderly as the consortium he served. The bond was a hostile occupation. It bypassed his walls, ignored his defenses. It was a direct feed of raw, chaotic emotion, Elian's emotion, piped into the center of his consciousness. The pain of the heat was a constant, grinding agony, a fire in his blood that his own biology interpreted as a call to action. But worse, far worse, were the flashes of memory, the echoes of a life he had never known. He felt the phantom chill of the archives, the sting of loneliness in a crowded commissary, the dull, pervasive ache of being fundamentally unseen. He felt Elian's quiet defiance, the small, secret rebellions of a spirit that refused to be completely extinguished, a preference for a certain data stream, a moment spent watching the artificial sunlight shift across a wall. Tiny, insignificant sparks of selfhood that now burned like stars in Valerius's mind. He activated the room's diagnostic console, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. A desperate retreat into the familiar comfort of technology and procedure. He needed data. He needed to quantify this enemy, to understand its mechanics, so he could dismantle it. He ran a full bioscan on Elian. The results, scrolling across the holographic display, the readings were impossible. Energy output that defied known biology, pheromonal concentrations that should have been lethal, and a neurological signature that was entangled. The scanner couldn't differentiate between Elian's brain activity and his own. It depicted their neural networks as two overlapping, interconnected systems. The bond was not just a psychic phenomenon, it was a physical, neurological reality. He was, in a measurable scientific sense, no longer a discrete individual. The thought was so abhorrent it made him physically ill. There are experimental bond-severing technologies, he said, more to himself than to Elian. His voice was flat, detached, a surgeon discussing an amputation. Developed from pre-consortium research. High risk, significant chance of neurological damage. He glanced at Elian, who was watching him with wide, fever-bright eyes. The Omega was sweating, his pale hair clinging to his temples, his body still trembling with the force of the heat. But his gaze was steady, and through the bond, Valerius felt not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. "You will not cut me out," the feeling came, clear as a spoken sentence. "You will not erase me." "It is a necessary risk," Valerius stated, turning back to the console, unable to meet that gaze. "This connection is a threat to security, to my function, to your stability." "My stability?" Elian's voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of engineered tranquility. "I have never been stable. I have been sedated. There is a difference." Valerius ignored him, accessing high-clearance schematics. The device was called a synaptic nullifier. It worked by generating a counter-resonant frequency, designed to disrupt the quantum entanglement that supposedly formed the basis of a bond. It was crude. It was dangerous. It had never been tested on a living subject, let alone a prime. Using it would be a shot in the dark, an act of desperation. But the alternative, allowing this bond to persist, to let this Omega take root in his soul, was unthinkable. He initiated the request, his authority code overriding the multiple safety lockouts. The machine was in a sub-level laboratory. It would take time to calibrate and bring online. Time he would have to spend in this room, with this Omega, with this bond tightening its grip. He turned to face Elian again, crossing his arms over his chest, a defensive posture he hadn't used since he was a boy. He needed to re-establish control, to put the Omega back in the box of subject and problem. "Until the nullifier is ready, you will be kept here under observation," he said, his tone clipped and official. "You will be sedated to manage the symptoms." Elian shook his head. "The sedatives won't work. Not anymore." He was right. Valerius knew it. The sheer force of a prime heat would burn through any conventional tranquilizer. It would be like trying to put out a star with a cup of water. And even if it worked, what then? He would be left alone in the silence, with only the ghost of Elian's consciousness inside his head. The thought was, to his horror, not a comforting one. "What do you want?" Valerius asked, the question an admission of defeat. He was no longer giving orders. He was negotiating. Elian took a shaky breath. The heat was cresting again, but he fought through it. His focus narrowed to this one singular point of leverage. "I want you to feel it," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "All of it. I've been alone with this my whole life. The emptiness before, the fire now. You don't get to turn it off just because it's inconvenient for you. It was the most defiant act of his life. He was not just accepting the bond, he was wielding it. He let the barriers in his mind fall, not just the pain and the fear, but everything. He pushed a memory through the connection, a small, vivid thing. He was a child in the Omega creche, watching other children being paired with their designated alpha guardians. He had never been chosen. He was a recessive, a genetic dead end, unworthy of a bond, even an artificial one. He was left to watch, feeling a hollow ache he didn't have a name for. Valerius grunted, stumbling back a step, his hand pressed against his chest as if to ward off a physical blow. The memory, the pure, undiluted loneliness of the child Elian pierced through his defenses with surgical precision. It was an emotion he understood too well. His own childhood had been one of isolation, of being set apart by his own potential, trained for a destiny that allowed for no attachments. He had called it discipline, he had called it strength, but seeing it reflected through Elian's experience, he recognized it for what it was, a profound, crushing solitude. "Stop that," he commanded, his voice rough with an emotion he refused to name. "Cease this transmission." "You wanted to know what I am," Elian retorted, his strength growing with every crack that appeared in the commander's facade. "This is what I am. This is what you made me." He didn't send another memory. He didn't have to. The channel was open now. Valerius was no longer just feeling the echo of Elian's emotions. He was feeling Elian. The quiet intelligence that observed everything in the archives, the hidden fascination with the chaotic histories he cataloged, the desperate, secret yearning for a touch, a scent, a connection that wasn't sterile and manufactured. He was seeing the person who had been buried beneath the designation. He was not Subject 734. He was Elian. And Valerius was beginning to understand, more real than anything else in his cold, well-ordered life. A chime sounded startlingly loud in the tense silence, a notification on the console. Valerius turned toward it, grateful for the distraction. The message was from the High Council. His unscheduled quarantine of a major sector had not gone unnoticed. They were demanding a report, a full, transparent report. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling entirely separate from the bond. The Council did not tolerate anomalies. They did not accept biological chaos. If they discovered the existence of a bonded prime Omega, they would not see a subject to be studied or a problem to be solved. They would see a threat to the very foundation of their society. They would order Elian's immediate termination. And if they discovered the bond had compromised a high commander, they would order his as well. The synaptic nullifier was no longer just a tool to restore his personal autonomy. It was the only thing that could save both their lives. He had to sever the bond, report Elian as a manageable, albeit unique biological anomaly, and erase any evidence of his own involvement. It was the logical, strategic choice, the only choice. He looked at Elian, who was now lying back, his eyes closed, exhausted by the last exchange. The fire of the heat had subsided for a moment, leaving him pale and fragile. In sleep, he looked impossibly young. A wave of protectiveness so fierce and so alien it stole Valerius's breath, washed over him. It was not his own emotion. It was the bond. It was the alpha instinct he had spent his life trying to conquer. It was telling him, in no uncertain terms, that the logical choice was a betrayal, that the only thing that mattered was the safety of the Omega in his care. The fortress of his mind, already under siege, began to crumble. Two directives, two realities, were at war within him. Serve the system that had made him. Protect the Omega who was unmaking him. He did not know which one would win, but he knew with chilling certainty that the battle would destroy him. The hours that followed were a strange, suspended agony. Valerius did not leave the room. He could not. The bond had a proximity effect. The further he moved from Elian, the more frayed and painful the connection became, like a nerve being stretched to its breaking point. He was tethered, a prisoner in the same sterile cube as the Omega. He occupied himself with work, pulling up data streams on the console, attempting to lose himself in logistics reports and personnel files. But it was a futile effort. The background noise of Elian's consciousness was a constant distraction. He was aware of the Omega's fitful sleep, of the feverish dreams that flickered through his mind. Fragmented images of endless white corridors, of faceless figures in gray uniforms, of a recurring dream of open sky. A thing Elian had only ever seen in simulations. The heat would rise in waves, and with each crest, Valerius would have to brace himself, gripping the edge of the console until the wave passed, leaving him shaken and sweating, his own heart pounding in a sympathetic rhythm. During one of these waves, Elian cried out in his sleep, a soft, broken sound. Without conscious thought, Valerius found himself at the side of the medical slab. He looked down at the Omega, at the sheen of sweat on his brow, the pain tension in his face. The alpha instinct, that monstrous, demanding thing, was screaming at him. Comfort him, scent him, show him he is safe. It was madness. It was a violation of every protocol, of his very identity. But the sight of Elian's distress, felt so keenly through the bond, was a torment he could not endure. Hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand on Elian's forehead. The skin was burning hot. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let his own scent, normally so tightly controlled, a neutral, almost non-existent thing, release just a fraction. It was the scent of cold stone and winter air of absolute calm. He pushed that sense of calm through the bond, a cool, quiet wave to counter the fire of the heat. You are safe. I am here. Elian's tense form relaxed. The pained cry subsided into a soft sigh. His breathing evened out. In his sleep, he turned his face into Valerius's touch, an unconscious, instinctual act of seeking comfort. Valerius froze, his hand still on Elian's forehead. The contact was a revelation. It did not just soothe the Omega, it soothed him. The roaring chaos in his own mind quieted to a manageable hum. The bond, which had been a source of pain and violation, settled into something else. Something that felt less like a chain and more like an anchor. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, retreating to the far side of the room. His heart was hammering against his ribs. What had he just done? He had given in. He had used his alpha scent, his alpha presence to soothe an Omega in heat. It was the most primitive, most instinctual, most forbidden act he could have committed, and it had felt right. The realization was more terrifying than the bond itself. The system was not just a set of rules he followed, it was the very structure of his mind. And he had just, willingly, taken a hammer to its foundation. A notification chimed on the console. Synaptic nullifier calibration complete. Awaiting deployment command. The moment of decision was here. Logic versus instinct. Duty versus bond. He looked at the message, then at the sleeping Omega. The path of logic was clear. Deploy the nullifier. Sever the connection. Erase the evidence. Survive. But survival would mean returning to the cold, sterile emptiness of his own existence. An emptiness he hadn't even been fully aware of until the bond had filled it with Elian's chaotic, vibrant, painful presence. It would mean returning Elian to his state as a subject, a specimen to be managed or disposed of. To sever the bond now would be an act of profound violence, a spiritual amputation for them both. He could feel through the quieted connection Elian's deep-seated terror of being abandoned, of being disconnected again. Using the nullifier would be a confirmation of that terror. It would be the ultimate betrayal. His finger hovered over the command interface. He was Commander Valerius. His purpose was to uphold order. This bond was the antithesis of order. It was chaos incarnate. He had to destroy it. He had to. His hand trembled. He thought of the child in the crèche, watching the other children being chosen. He thought of the quiet archivist, finding solace in the ghost of a forgotten world. He thought of the defiant spirit that had looked a high commander in the eye and demanded to be seen, to be felt. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was alien. Valerius closed his eyes. The choice was not between logic and instinct. It was between the system he had sworn to serve and the person he was now sworn, by a force older than any system, to protect. He opened his eyes and his choice was made. He keyed in a command, but it was not the one to deploy the nullifier. Instead, he sent a coded, encrypted message to a single contact, a name buried so deep in the system it was practically a ghost. A contact from his past before he had become a commander, before he had perfected his mask of control. The message was short, just 3 words: asset compromised, initiate extraction. He had just declared war on the consortium. He had just chosen the Omega. He had just, for the first time in his life, disobeyed. The air in the room seemed to change, the tension shifting from one of conflict to one of conspiracy. He was no longer Elian's warden. He was his co-conspirator. He had thrown his life, his career, his entire identity onto a single desperate gamble. He walked back to the medical slab. Elian was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. The fever of the heat was still there, but the raw panic was gone, replaced by a wary confusion. He felt the shift in Valerius through the bond. The internal war had ceased. A decision had been made. "What did you do?" Elian whispered, his voice still weak. "I have delayed the nullifier," Valerius said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was not the whole truth, but it was the only truth he could offer right now. "The Council is asking questions. We are running out of time." He did not say what they were running out of time for. He did not say that he had just signed both their death warrants, with only the faintest hope of a pardon in the form of an escape. Elian pushed himself up on his elbows, his gaze searching Valerius's face. He could feel the commander's resolve, a cold, hard certainty that had not been there before. But he could also feel the immense risk, the terrifying gamble. "They will kill me," Elian stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "They will try," Valerius corrected him. The unspoken promise in those 2 words was deafening. "I will not let them." For the first time, Elian looked at the imposing Alpha before him and did not see a monster or a warden. He saw an ally, a deeply conflicted, dangerous, and terrifying ally, but an ally nonetheless. The bond, which had been a battlefield, was now a bridge, a fragile, untested bridge over a chasm of certain death. "Why?" Elian asked, the question carrying the weight of a lifetime of being considered worthless. "Why would you do this for me?" Valerius looked at him, his steel-gray eyes holding an emotion Elian could not decipher. It was not pity, it was not desire. It was something more complex, something akin to recognition, as if he were seeing not just Elian, but a part of himself that had been lost for a very long time. "Logic dictates that a compromised commander is a liability to be neutralized," Valerius said, his voice clinical as if describing a tactical problem. "And a prime Omega is a threat to be eliminated. The system I serve would see us both erased." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "However, my primary function has been reassigned. My new directive is your survival. It is an illogical, inefficient, and strategically unsound directive." He took a step closer. "But it is absolute." It was the closest he could come to a confession. He could not speak of the bond in terms of emotion or connection. He could only frame it in the language he understood: function, directive, purpose. His purpose was no longer the consortium. His purpose was Elian. The Omega stared at him, 1,000 questions in his eyes, but he didn't ask any of them. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance, of trust. It was a trust Valerius had done nothing to earn and everything to violate. Yet, here it was, a fragile, impossible gift. Their alliance was sealed not with words, but with the silent humming current of the bond that flowed between them, a current that was no longer a source of pain, but a promise of a shared fate, for better or for worse. The waiting was a new form of torment. Valerius monitored the facility's internal security network, his mind a whirlwind of tactical analysis. Every passing guard, every shift in the patrol schedules was a potential threat. He was plotting an escape from a fortress he had helped design. He knew its strengths, its choke points, its surveillance blind spots. He also knew its ruthlessness. The response to his message came not as a reply, but as a subtle, almost imperceptible system glitch. A diagnostic report for the ventilation system in a forgotten service tunnel was flagged for a manual override, a single character in the code altered. It was the signal. The extraction was confirmed. The window would be short, the path precise. It would happen during the shift change, when the automated systems were momentarily rebooting. They had one chance. He turned his attention to Elian. The Omega was weak, the prolonged heat having taken a severe toll on his body. He was in no condition to run, to fight, to endure the rigors of an escape. "We need to move," Valerius said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Can you walk?" Elian swung his legs over the side of the slab, his feet touching the cold floor. He stood and immediately swayed, his vision tunneling. The world was a dizzying blur. Valerius was at his side in an instant, a strong arm wrapping around his waist, holding him steady. The contact sent a jolt through them both. It was not like the brief, hesitant touch before. This was solid, purposeful, supportive. "I have you," Valerius said, his voice low and close to Elian's ear. The words and the raw certainty behind them were a lifeline. Elian leaned into the support, his body still trembling, but his will hardening. "Yes," he said, his voice a determined whisper, "I can walk." Valerius procured 2 dark hooded cloaks from a service locker, part of a standard technician's uniform. They were anonymous, unremarkable, perfect for blending into the shadows. As he helped Elian into one, his fingers brushed against the Omega's neck. He could feel the frantic, fluttering pulse beneath the skin. Through the bond he felt Elian's fear, a sharp, cold spike, but underneath it was a fierce, burning resolve. The quiet archivist was gone, replaced by a survivor. Valerius felt a surge of something he could only identify as pride. It was a completely alien emotion, and it shook him to his core. "The path will be difficult," Valerius explained, his voice a low murmur as he pulled his own cloak on, the hood shadowing his face. "We will move through the lower service corridor. Stay close. Do not speak. I will handle any encounters." He did not mention that handling an encounter would mean neutralizing fellow officers, men and women he had trained and commanded. He had compartmentalized that reality. They were obstacles. The mission was Elian's survival. All other considerations were secondary. The door to the medical room hissed open. The corridor outside was empty. It was time. They stepped out of the sterile white cube and into the gray, utilitarian world of the facility's underbelly. The air here was different, thick with the smell of ozone from the power conduits and the metallic tang of machinery. For Elian, whose senses were still wildly amplified by the heat, it was an overwhelming assault. He stumbled, his head swimming. Valerius's grip on his arm tightened, a silent command to focus. They moved in silence, their soft-soled boots making almost no sound on the grated floor. The corridors were a labyrinth of pipes and conduits, lit by the stark, intermittent glow of emergency lighting. It was a world away from the clean, bright spaces of the upper levels. This was the facility's guts, the machinery that kept the illusion of order running. Through the bond, Valerius fed Elian a stream of calming reassurance, a steady, rhythmic pulse to counteract the sensory overload. He also transmitted his awareness of their surroundings, the location of the next patrol, the hum of a nearby surveillance camera, the precise timing needed to slip past a motion sensor. They were moving as one organism, their minds linked, their purpose singular. They rounded a corner and came face to face with two Praetorian guards. Elian's heart leaped into his throat. There was no time to run, no place to hide. The guards' heads snapped up, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. "Halt!" one of them commanded, his voice amplified by his helmet. "Identify yourselves." Valerius stepped forward, shielding Elian with his body. He kept his head down, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. "Technicians," he said, his voice altered, roughened, responding to a ventilation diagnostic. "Sector Gamma 9. The guard took a step closer, his visor reflecting the dim light. "Your clearance isn't registering for this level. Remove your hoods." Valerius didn't move. He projected a wave of pure alpha authority. Not a scent, but a psychic pressure. A command to obey. "There is nothing to see here. Move on." The first guard hesitated, his training warring with the primal instinct to submit to a superior alpha. But the second guard was less susceptible. He raised his weapon. "I said, remove your hoods. Now." In a single, fluid motion, Valerius moved. He was not a commander anymore. He was a weapon. He struck the second guard in the throat with the edge of his hand, a precise, brutal blow that sent the man crumpling to the floor without a sound. Before the first guard could even react, Valerius had disarmed him, twisting the weapon from his grasp and striking him on the temple with the butt of the rifle. The guard collapsed, unconscious. It was over in less than 3 seconds. A display of lethal, controlled violence that was both terrifying and breathtaking. Elian stared, his mind reeling. He had just watched the calm, calculating commander take down 2 of his own men with ruthless efficiency. The man who had spoken of order and stability had just created chaos and violence to protect him. Valerius stood over the unconscious guards, his chest rising and falling heavily. He didn't look at Elian. Through the bond, Elian felt a tremor of something he hadn't felt from the commander before. Self-loathing, a deep, profound disgust at the violence he had just committed, at the betrayal of his own code. But it was quickly suppressed, buried under a layer of cold, hard necessity. "We have to go," Valerius said, his voice flat. "They will be found soon." He pulled Elian along, his pace faster now, more urgent. They were no longer just evading detection. They were fugitives. The blood was on their hands now, his blood, but their shared fate. The escape was no longer a theoretical gamble. It was a grim, brutal reality. They reached the designated extraction point, a heavy maintenance hatch leading to the outer wall's ventilation shafts. It was sealed with a mag lock that required a high commander's authorization code. Valerius pressed his palm to the scanner. A light blinked from red to green. The lock hissed open. He pulled the heavy hatch open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft filled with the roar of powerful fans. The wind that blasted out was cold and carried the scent of rain and industrial fumes, the scent of the outside world. Elian, who had only ever breathed recycled, purified air, gasped. It was a raw, overwhelming smell full of life and decay. It was the scent of freedom. "The shaft leads to the perimeter wall," Valerius explained over the noise. "My contact has disabled the fans in this section, but they will reactivate in 7 minutes. We have to climb." He looked at Elian, his shadowed face grim. "It will be difficult." Elian looked into the dark, roaring abyss of the shaft. Maintenance rungs were set into the wall, disappearing up into the darkness. It looked impossible. His body was still weak, aching. But then he looked at Valerius. He saw the man who had abandoned his entire life, who had betrayed his own principles, who had committed violence against his own men, all for him. He would not let that sacrifice be for nothing. He met the commander's gaze, and for the first time, he pushed something back through the bond. Not fear or pain, but strength. A quiet, determined strength that Valerius had unknowingly helped him find. "I am ready." Valerius gave a single sharp nod. He went first, disappearing into the shaft, his movements sure and practiced. Elian followed, his hands closing around the cold metal of the first rung. The climb was a vertical hell. Each movement was a protest from his exhausted muscles. The roar of the distant fans was a constant, deafening pressure. The wind tore at his cloak, threatening to rip him from his precarious hold. He focused on the dark shape of Valerius above him, a steady presence in the roaring dark. The bond was their lifeline. When Elian's grip faltered, he felt a surge of strength from Valerius, a projection of will and endurance that flowed into his own limbs. When a wave of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him, he felt Valerius's calm, steadying presence anchor his mind. They were climbing as one, a single entity with two bodies, their shared will set against the cold, hard reality of the metal wall. They were nearing the top when a deep, shuddering groan echoed through the shaft. The fans. They were starting to reactivate ahead of schedule. The wind velocity increased dramatically, a solid wall of force that threatened to peel them from the rungs. "Faster!" Valerius's voice was a faint shout against the rising roar. Elian pulled himself upward, his lungs burning, his arms screaming in protest. He could feel Valerius's urgency, his tactical mind calculating their dwindling chances. Below them, a section of fans whirred to life, their giant blades beginning to spin, turning the shaft beneath them into a deadly vortex. Just as Elian's strength gave out completely, his fingers slipping on a rung, a strong hand clamped around his wrist. Valerius had reached the top platform and was leaning down, his grip like a steel vise. He hauled Elian up the last few feet, pulling him over the edge onto a small, grated platform. They collapsed together, gasping for breath as the full fury of the ventilation system roared to life beneath them. They had made it. The platform opened onto the outer skin of the consortium citadel, a vast, windswept ledge hundreds of stories above the ground. The sky above was not the simulated blue of the facility, but a real sky, bruised with the colors of a polluted twilight. Rain began to fall, cold and sharp, plastering their cloaks to their bodies. Elian stood, his face turned up to the sky, letting the rain wash over him. It was the first time he had ever felt real weather. The sensation was shocking, alien, and breathtakingly beautiful. In the distance, below the imposing, sterile geometry of the citadel, lay the unregulated zones, a sprawling, chaotic expanse of older cities and wilderness that the consortium had abandoned but had been unable to completely eradicate. It was a dark, tangled smear on the horizon, lit by rogue fires and unregulated lights. It looked like chaos. It looked like freedom. A low-frequency hum filled the air, and a small, unmarked transport craft rose from the shadows below, its running lights off. It hovered silently beside their ledge. The cockpit canopy slid open, revealing a single, grim-faced pilot, Valerius's contact. Valerius pulled Elian toward the craft. As they boarded, he paused and looked back at the towering citadel, a monument of glass and steel that had been his entire world. Through the bond, Elian felt a complex wave of emotions from him. Regret, loss, but also a profound, earth-shattering sense of liberation. The canopy closed, sealing them inside. The craft banked sharply and sped away from the citadel, a silent ghost disappearing into the rain and the gathering darkness. Inside the cockpit, the roar of the wind was replaced by the low hum of the engines. Elian was shivering from the cold and the adrenaline and the sheer, overwhelming reality of what had just happened. A heavy cloak was draped over his shoulders. It was Valerius's. It carried his scent, the cool, clean smell of winter stone, now tinged with the ozone of the storm. It was a scent of safety, of sanctuary. "The heat," Elian whispered, his teeth chattering. "It's fading." The ordeal, the adrenaline, the shock of the escape had somehow broken its fever pitch. It was still there, a low, pulsing ache, but the overwhelming, mind-shattering need had receded. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been in his life, but his mind felt clear. His mind felt like his own again, albeit an ownness that was now permanently shared. He looked at Valerius, who was staring out at the receding citadel, his expression unreadable. "Where are we going?" Elian asked. Valerius turned his gaze from the window to him. His steel-gray eyes, which had once been so cold and clinical, now held a depth Elian was only just beginning to understand. "Somewhere the consortium cannot reach us," he said. "Somewhere you can be what you are, without a designation." The simple statement held a world of promise. Not to be Subject 734, not to be a recessive or a prime or an asset, just to be. The transport flew on, leaving the sterile order of their past behind, plunging into the chaotic uncertainty of their future. The bond between them hummed, no longer a source of conflict, but a quiet, constant presence. It was a map of each other's souls, a testament to the fact that even in the most controlled system, there are forces that cannot be contained. The man of logic had embraced the chaos. The Omega who was thought to be weak had found a strength he never knew he possessed. They were two broken pieces of a broken system fleeing into the dark. But for the first time in the quiet intimacy of the cockpit, surrounded by the scent of rain and the promise of an unknown horizon, they were not alone. They were whole.